Okay, welcome everyone to the virtual AAA Symposium on Hemponomics. I am Rigoberto Lopez, I'm a professor at the University of Connecticut and the organizer and moderator of this event. Please note that the first 30 minutes will be devoted to presentation with limited discussion, and then the last 30 minutes will be devoted to open discussion. I encourage everyone to participate and to maximize output from this session. So a few comments before we start. Cannabinoid or CBD products have been deemed a miracle pain and anxiety reliever that could also enhance mood at the consumer level. No wonder a big demand push for this type of products resulting in a rapidly growing market, including a fantastic rapid expansion of farm production for CBD purposes. Literally, it has been an agricultural gold rush in the last 6 years. So, so let me share some of the slides then and go from there. If we look at in the next slide at the U.S. hemp acres planted, we can see a 100-fold increase in acreage of hemp at the farm level. But then what happened in the last month, USDA published the latest numbers, and it shows a 67% decline in acreage of hemp acres. So this is a surprise. You know, this is contrary to what people were expecting. In Connecticut, people were talking about $60,000 an acre for growing hemp for CBD purposes, and all of a sudden we see a steep decline, which preceded our workshop actually when we were planning the workshop or the symposium. At the retail level, we see at least the projected for 2019, we see sales of CBD products at the consumer level increasing, and they're bound to keep increasing. Apparently, maybe Trey Malone can talk more about those trends. And so ultimately, then what happens when supply outpaces demand, then prices start to decline. At the beginning, it seemed that there was an excess demand for CBD products, but now the tables are turned. So, so in this session, what we're going to do is to discuss the potential prospects, pitfalls, and economic sustainability of the emerging trends in demand, supply, regulation, and competition in the U.S. Industrial hemp industry, with particular implications for farmers. To disentangle and help us understand these trends, we have an outstanding panel of 3 experts. Okay, so the first presenter is Jelliffe, who is a research agricultural economist with the USDA Economic Research Service in the Markets and Trade Economics Division. Jeremy received a PhD in agricultural and resource economics from the University of Connecticut in May 2020. His research focuses on agricultural trade and productivity in the US and the European Union, agricultural development in sub-Saharan Africa, and the US wine, dairy, and hemp industries. The title of his presentation, as shown there, is To Produce or Not to Produce, Break-Even Analysis and Market Consideration. Next, we're going to listen from Trey Malone, who is an assistant professor and extension economist in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. Trey received a PhD in agricultural economics from Oklahoma State University. He has won multiple research awards and has published dozens of articles in peer-reviewed journals. Trey's work has also been featured in bylines for popular press outlets such as USDA Today, Fast Company, and Popular Science, to cite a few. And of course, we see him at least every other month in the AAA blog of members in the news. So the title of his presentation is Exploring US Demand for Hemp Products. And last but not least, we will listen from James Stearns, who's an associate professor in the Department of Applied Economics at Oregon State University. James received a PhD in agricultural economics from Michigan State University. His research areas include agribusiness management, the performance of agri-food system in the Pacific Northwest, specialty crops, and most recently, the Oregon wine industry. As a matter of fact, this year, James received the AAEA's Outstanding Choices Article Award for his article on Is the Emergency U.S. Hemp Industry Yet Another Boom-Bust Market for U.S. Farmers? So I would say that he is particularly qualified for his presentation on threat of entry and competition in the U.S. hemp industries. So without further ado, I would like to go to Jeremy then, and I'm going to stop sharing this so that he can share his slides. So, okay, so Jeremy, take it away.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Jelliffe. I'm at the United States Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service. I began there earlier this summer. And in this symposium, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the producer side and then some of the considerations that are becoming more and more in the minds of people that have gotten into this industry of how do you market and get this product sold. So Hemponomics, to produce or not to produce, break even and market considerations. This comes out of some work that I did with Rigoberto. We released a report in February of this year analyzing CBD hemp production costs and returns, specifically for Connecticut farmers. You can find this report at the ZWIC website under the outreach reports. And in the report, we focus mainly on a system of hemp production and looking at returns under this system of hemp production that we believe is most representative of the Northeast, New England, and is being widely used throughout the country. This is one graphic that we really thought was useful for prospective growers, which is basically showing break-even levels at a given price. So at a higher price of $2, on the y-axis, we have CBD content. So what percentage of CBD is in the dried hemp flower, as well as weight by yield of the amount of dried flower in pounds on a per acre basis. And you can see here that, for instance, at a 7% CBD content flower, you're basically looking at about 1,300 pound yield to be able to break even, assuming that you have this $2 price point. Clearly, as the price decreases, you have to have higher quality in terms of CBD content, as well as higher output in terms of yield. Originally, when we published it, we were probably closer to this $1.25. A nice target might have been 2,000 pounds per acre, 8% CBD, but now we're closer to $1, even 80 cents a pound if you look at hemp benchmarks, which is going to put us in this area between the 50-cent mark and the $1.25. And so currently, we would think that just to talk about a break even, that you would basically need to achieve, in this case, 10% CBD and 3,000 pounds, which, given current regulations and seed constraints to finding quality seed with low THC potential, it's become increasingly risky and difficult for farmers to reach for these targets without risking creating a crop that is hot. Now, of course, the USDA rules that are supposed to go into effect this year have certain protocols. However, I know that in the recent news, some senators and so forth have encouraged USDA to look at postponing some of these regulations. In fact, New York State pulled their entire hemp program, given they do not believe that it will be viable for their farmers and for them to regulate it, so it would defer to the federal policy. If we want to look more closely at these budgets, what you'll see here is that, again, we're assuming this higher price, we have a return of about $22,000, a little over $22,000. Now, considering a number of different budgets presented through the country, all of them, and I was at the Cornell Hemp Field Day a couple weeks ago, all of them have a very similar variable cost total. And so you're seeing these come in around $12,000, give or take. Where some of the differences in terms of the different production practices we're seeing is in the built-in assumptions under fixed costs. In fact, Connecticut budgets that we put together include the greatest fixed costs. Part of that is it potentially is a little more costly to farm in Connecticut, but really what we're getting at here is some of the additional valuation of management and so forth that we felt were important to include in the analysis. Under these prices, we found that it was slightly profitable, or with about a $3,000 return over total cost. But if we're looking at just variable costs, we're at about this $9,000. Of course, at the current prices, this has been shrinking more and more. At about 80 cents, I would think this is about $4,000 over variable costs, maybe a little more than that. Finally, turning to some market considerations, the first thing that comes to mind is, where has hemp been grown historically? Obviously, the prohibition in the US has meant that hemp has not been grown here as much, and other areas of the world where hemp has been produced have continued to do so and have established industry and production there. Specifically, we think about China, Canada, and the European Union, where France dominates among those countries. Of course, for some of the grain and fiber specifically, growers have become more interested in niche opportunities for specific types of fiber that can be used and processed for industrial uses. However, the majority of marketed hemp products that are grown in the US have really focused in on the CBD. And so some things we think about under the CBD use of hemp is, what are we seeing for prices? What are some of the processing considerations and marketing considerations? Clearly, there are some issues with certified seed. Early on, the seeds were incredibly expensive, about $1 a seed. They've come down as more companies have started to market them. In addition, a lot of hemp for CBD is grown from clones. And so there's also a market for clones. And these costs, again, have come down over time as more and more have entered into this, this industry. However, there is uncertainty about some of these certified seeds and the quality and how homozygous they are in order to grow these effectively and efficiently in the field. Certain characteristics like uniform flowering and low THC and so forth need to be had in order to do that well. So another idea here is that, why are we seeing such volatility in the prices to growers? Well, clearly with the sort of boom, the notion of the boom, there's a lot of supply on the market and a lot of people that came in and grew a lot of hemp in the previous year. And so this alone could be driving some of that. On the other side, processors have had significant control over their ability to negotiate and get a low price for hemp flower. And so we can think about some monopsony type scenarios where a very powerful buyer side is basically driving down the cost, because the usable forms of this are largely processed. Furthermore, looking at the types of firms we do observe who grow CBD, we see that many of them are vertically integrated and control their own production through processing and marketing, or they have very strong producer contracts that they work with a set of growers. We could think about this as being similar to the hops industry in the Pacific Northwest, potentially. Obviously, there's a range of consumer products here, from topicals and salves, even infused clothing. There was an interesting article about the US military and CBD infused footwear and how that fell under the guideline of the government. Gels, creams, oils, the exercise industry, we've seen this. In terms of a supplement, a lot of edibles, and then also combustibles, people, whether they vaporize it in a vapor pen or they smoke dried flower. And so finally, I touched a little bit on, but the marketing channels, especially in the time of COVID, have seemed to become increasingly important, where some of these companies in their ability to market direct to consumer and to have sort of that vertical integration branding, we've seen in the industry, as well as how the distribution and point of sale might shift given future developments in the regulation of this product. So, thank you all very much. That's all I have. Please feel free to contact me at jeremy.jelliffe@usda.gov, and you can find out more about ERS and what we do at the ERS website.
So we have, hello, we have a question. I don't know if it is to you or to everyone. Do you know the current status of CBD with the FDA?
I can't specifically comment on that.
Okay.
Just from reading the news, I know that this is something that has been brought up, and some have been making a case for CBD hemp to be further regulated by FDA. Clearly, one of the regulated products by FDA is the drug, the anti-seizure medication. That is a prescribable drug that's been cleared by FDA. But in terms of sort of mass market CBD, I don't really have a whole lot. I think that would clearly raise some issues in terms of how these products are regulated and their availability in the marketplace.
Okay, great. So, so why don't we move on then to Trey Malone, and then at the end we have ample of time for discussion. So, good question. Thank you, Chris. You need to unmute yourself, Trey.
There we go.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Great. Yes.
I've recorded many lectures today. Also, that's why my subtitles are on, because you have to subtitle things now. So I will be talking about hemp and CBD from more of a consumer side. This is something that, you know, at least for me personally, I didn't, if you'd have told me, or I think anybody else on this call, that we were going to be talking about hemp in 2020, you know, when I graduated in 2017, I would have never told you that this was a thing. But here we are, we're talking about it. I actually published a paper kind of early on this, trying to understand why it was illegal in the first place. You know, a lot of the reading that I went into it kind of struck me that I think there's a lot of misconception about whether or not people actually think there is a difference between hemp and marijuana. So I sent out just a quick survey to ask people if they thought there was a difference. And about 2/3 of Americans thought there is actually a difference between hemp and marijuana, which is, and this was a couple years ago, which was, I mean, honestly, kind of surprising that there were that many people that believed that. So that was kind of my first foray into it. So my job is, I'm an extension economist at Michigan State University. So that means I spend a lot of time working with people in the field and hearing what new thing they're going to try to make money. So in Michigan, we grow a lot of things. Hops were the hot topic when I first got here in 2017. Hops are in a little bit different cycle now, where people are kind of maturing out of the market or growing or finding new places. And so hemp was the next big one. So I gave a talk, a few months back now. It feels like a million years, but I gave a talk about the potential for the economics of hemp to be kind of a long-term thing. I talked about cobweb models and kind of your standard economics. I threw up a slide about CBD going mainstream. If you're looking for kind of an interesting market analysis with a lot of really simple data, I would recommend this article in Consumer Reports. They did some survey work back in about a year ago to figure out who's consuming this stuff. You know, they found a huge age difference. So, I mean, there is this age component of CBD use as of then. But that kind of spurred this question to me of like, okay, so what if we try to sort this out from more of an economics perspective and less of just a market segment perspective? And so the first thing that we wanted to try to understand is what the perceptions of the homegrown values are of CBD or hemp-derived products relative to other possible substitutes for the product. So we sent out a survey of about 1,000 people, and we asked people, the possible for medical use between all these products. So, and then we grouped them based on kind of the potential for medical use. If you'll notice, marijuana, CBD, those actually are kind of grouped together more than THC and hemp. So for whatever reason, people actually have this perception that that marijuana has a higher potential for medical use than hemp. We also, of course, on the flip side of any type of medical question, you also are curious about the potential for abuse. So, so we asked same group of products, but then we tried to group it based on the potential for abuse. And now if you'll notice, heroin and cocaine, obviously, heroin, cocaine, meth, oxycodone have the highest potential for abuse in our sample. But if you'll notice, alcohol is far more concerning in terms of potential for abuse than marijuana and THC. CBD and hemp kind of came in even lower than that, which again is kind of an interesting take when it comes to what the potential is for this market. Now, if you plot these two groups, you start seeing kind of, I think, an interesting 4 market segments. So, so coffee was on our list, and it has basically like the lowest potential for abuse and also no real medical use, which people kind of could accurately identify down in that bottom left quadrant that coffee sits there. But if you'll notice where CBD, hemp, THC, and marijuana is, now I'm sorry if this is a little bit foggy on your screen, but marijuana and THC had a potential for abuse, but had, you know, a relatively, I don't know, possible medical use relative to some other products. Now, hemp and CBD is kind of in the sweet spot, honestly. Consumers believe there's a low potential for abuse, and there also is some possible medical use for the product. So moving forward, I think this is actually kind of promising for that, the potential growth of that market. Now, we also broke down what people are using this product for. Now, in general, again, you'll have to read the paper. It's second round of revisions at addictive behaviors right now. So it should be out hopefully soon. The revisions weren't super hard. But what we found is that a lot of people were really using CBD for better sleep. That was one that I think I was a little surprised by. Reducing pain and reducing stress and anxiety also plays an important role. Now, when I think about kind of the future of this crop, so I just threw up the state ballot proposal 1 because it actually did mention hemp here in Michigan. So we now have recreational marijuana in Michigan. And I think over time, we're going to see more and more legal cannabis across the country. It feels like a kind of a foregone conclusion to me. Now, there is that question. There's also a question about indoor-outdoor production. I see, so Christy Apple is joining us. If y'all are on social media, Christy Apple is kind of my go-to expert on hemp right now. Christy, before I even jumped on this, I called Christy to ask if she would talk me through kind of what she's seeing on the ground, because she is, in my mind, probably the go-to hemp person right now in the Midwest. But she's kind of doesn't see hemp necessarily as a gateway crop as much as I kind of wonder about, but I do think there is some question mark there. I thought I'd finally conclude with kind of this long-term trend question that James brought up. So here are some Google Trends data that I just pulled this morning. If you notice the kind of growth in Google Trends of CBD over time, that kind of culminated there in 2019 when everybody was talking about CBD. And now we're seeing a decrease at some level, or maybe a flattening out at something that isn't quite to the same level. Now, what's interesting about that is that we've all been in the middle of the apocalypse for like months now, and you would think that that high stress moment would increase our desire to find some type of stress reliever. But it looks like CBD hasn't been one of the big winners in that space. Now, Christy's on the call, so I'm hoping that we can just kind of open the floor for conversation later. But Christy this morning claims that so CBD isn't the thing we need to be paying attention to. She says that Delta-8 is this kind of new thing that people are talking about. She's also kind of concerned about these FDA interim rules as to what this Delta-8 compound is going to look like in the future for the marketplace, but there is some possibility there. Again, I've really highlighted fiber and grain, or I've highlighted like CBD and extract markets, but fiber and grain is something that people are really looking at hard right now. I think that the USDA is actually increasing its at least from the panels that I've on, there's a lot of interest of people who are looking for kind of hemp-related outcomes that we'll have to see kind of in the future. On the ground, it does seem a little bit interesting how many people are wanting to get into the hemp market, but we're developing this industry from the ground up. So you don't have a Michigan Apple Committee or a Corn Growers Association of hemp that's really like the same kind of political power or lobbying capacity that you might have with substitute products such as maybe cotton. But with that, I'm going to close out and we can kind of talk longer at the end. So thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Okay, James. James, now, why don't we go on to James then?
All right, can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see you, hear you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
You got the PowerPoint slides now? Okay, well, let's talk about them a little bit. I think I was invited to be part of this panel because of an article I wrote in the Choices AEA publication back in the summer of 2019. And so I'm kind of trying to update and reprise some of the insights that I provided in that article. I start out with this title, you know, hemp industry, or is it hemp industries? I think one of the things we need to keep in mind, and Trey was alluding to it a lot, even though even his survey work, that article, draft article manuscript that he was referring to, a study of CBD, but there are multiple industries within the umbrella of hemp. And so I think that's something that we need to make sure we are cognitive of as we discuss where this industry is headed. So in that Choices article, I kind of touched on, you know, what's happening in this industry, what might happen in this industry, what have we learned since 2019 in terms of some of the primary foci that I had in that article in terms of on-farm profitability, supply chain viability, and market volatility. And so I want to touch on those topics. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking. I really want to get us to our open discussion among the panelists with our audience. So I just want to touch on these three briefly, and then we can bounce it to the open discussion. So in terms of on-farm profitability, points I made in the article, and I think they're still extremely relevant today, you know, from 2019, 2020, what are the lessons learned? I still think that there are some significant barriers to entry and issues in terms of how we're competing in this marketplace. Has a lot to do with your access to inputs. Jeremy already alluded to the issue of seed and access to quality seed and clones, the idea of access to processing. We had a lot of problems out here in the Pacific Northwest, and I think I heard similar stories throughout the U.S. in terms of what do you do with your product once it's harvested from a farmer perspective. Trying to get it dried and processed was a real bottleneck in the supply chain. And so those who had access or somehow had locked in to processing post-harvest had a competitive advantage. Similarly with support services, things like testing and quality assurances and things like that, crop insurance even. I think that we need to and farm credit would be another supporting services. Again, not everybody had equal access to that, and so that made it, I think, a difference for some producers. Issues of market power. I think we look back to 2018 fondly. It was a seller's market. Those who had hemp products were really seeing extraordinary high prices. And then, of course, 2019 came along, and the market dynamics switched, and then it became a buyer's market in the sense of that there was an abundance of product and prices, as we have seen, have fallen considerably. And so then when times get tough, you start asking the tough questions in terms of who's bearing what risk, who has to pay for what. Those farmers that had negotiated contracting relationships weren't even protected. A lot of times there are issues of enforcement. There's a lot of litigation going on even to this day, as probably everybody who's listening to this conversation knows. And so these are continued threats to a farmer or producer's ability to protect their margins. And so I think we need to keep the conversation going about these various issues. So in addition to on-farm profitability, we have issues of supply chain viability.
Okay. Please mute your microphone, the one, except for the presenter, of course.
Yeah. So apparently someone's really excited about supply chain viability. So this issue of you know, what is this nascent industry dealing with? Clearly, there was a lot of demonstrated opportunism. That's an old Oliver Williamson concept from his transaction cost literature. This idea that you know, people are going to behave in their own self-interest in an opportunistic way, and so as issues of product quality, hot material, supply chain relations, really there's been some really bad examples of what can go wrong in the marketplace. And unfortunately, we don't have very much in terms of reputational effects that can be imposed or that exist in other industries. Anything from Better Business Bureau to the Blue Book, which the lumber industry and the fresh produce industry has. Ideas of are our agents bonded, you know, and in what ways are we protected, and so none of those institutional contexts have really emerged yet within the hemp industry, and so those are going to be continuing problems to sustain supply chain viability. Building capacity, it's just not about product volume. You know, we like to think as economists that demand and supply are going to equalize themselves out. But we have so many different product categories. Again, to my original point about, is it a hemp industry or hemp industries? And so how do you get to a point of critical mass within a given product category? And so, you know, how does the supply chain sustain itself if it doesn't have enough product within it? And then lastly, building demand, this issue of relative pricing. I really think that the point I made in the Choices article is still true today. It's this issue of, it's not what you can do with hemp and all the multitude of potential products, but rather at what price. And so, you know, many of the things that you can do with hemp already have existing product substitutes, and so there's a real issue there in terms of relative pricing, which we don't know yet, and that's a supply chain issue that has yet to be resolved. Similarly with quality assurance, you know, in terms of the quality of products, signaling of quality in the marketplace, all of these things are vital to supply chain viability, and they're still being sorted out. And so as I think to the last slide, market volatility, I think really if we're looking at the future of the hemp industry, this is probably where the most opportunity for improved market performance lies. How can we actually tame that volatility? One of the things I really think is we need better metrics in terms of industry performance. I mean, we look at 2019, Everybody was so excited about that 511,000 acres that were licensed, and a lot of people got caught up in that. And then you start looking at, well, how many of those licensed acres actually got planted? And then of those planted acres, how many got harvested? And then of those that got harvested, what actual product got processed? And we're probably looking at less than 20% of that 511,000 acres of 2019 actually ended up into a finished good, into a finished product. And so we need to have better metrics. I think we clearly need better genetics. And I think that my hemp, if I'm a CBD grower, is not going to be at all like your hemp if you're growing it to fiber, which is not going to be at all like somebody else's hemp who's growing it for food crop as hemp seed. And so the good news is that hemp is an incredibly versatile plant. It grows in every state, and yet because of the legal history of hemp, we don't have good genetics out there yet. But I think there's the potential for an explosion of genetic breeding and plant propagation that becomes much more targeted. I have some familiarity, prior research in the apple industry, and there's apples for fresh market, there's apples for the processed market, and historically, if you go way back, there were apples for the cider market. And so we're going to start looking at that kind of parallel thinking in the hemp market. Well, my hemp's not going to be like your hemp, not only because of its end use, but also because of the dynamics of the locale, the growing conditions. And so we definitely need better genetics, also a whole lot more regulatory clarity. I alluded to this in the 2019 Choices article in terms of what happened in Canada. They were 20 years in and they're still trying to sort out the regulatory environment. To think that we're going to have regulatory clarity in the near future is, I think, a bit naive and overly optimistic. And so there's all kinds of issues there. And we need to get with new product development, again, beyond proof of concept, that point I was making about relative pricing. So it's not just what we can do with hemp, but at what price. Truly defendable market niches, or are we just looking at another commodity? And I think that that's a realization, particularly in the fiber market. And we're looking at another crop that a farmer can add to crop rotation, or are we actually looking at something that's growing and being used to produce a product for a defined niche market that is easily defendable? Something that I alluded to in the Choices article as well. So the bottom line here is I think we just need a longer time frame. Not only do we need more information across all of these issues of taming the market, but we just have a lot to learn. And to think that hemp is going to be this incredible manna from heaven type stuff for U.S. agriculture, I think that 2019 kind of burst that bubble. And as we look to 2020, it doesn't mean that we need to abandon hemp, but rather I think we just need to recognize that markets develop and evolve over time, and it's going to take that time period for us to really get a sense about where hemp is ultimately headed. And so with that, that's mainly meant to hopefully spark conversation among everybody's in on the Zoom call. So let's hope that happens. So Rigo, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do that in Zoom land. And I'll let you take over.
You can click and close it. Or
I find it. Yep. Stop share.
Okay. All right. Okay, then. We have a question from Chris Lawton. Can you see it? It was sent to everyone. The second question, any insight as to the balance between production and CBD processing capacity? I have heard that the surge in production has exceeded available processing capacity. From Chris Lawton from Farm Credit East. So anybody wants to take that question? Any of the panelists?
I could comment sort of in order. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the word on the street, is that a number of producers are sitting still on some of their crop from the previous growing season, and we're almost at harvest for this year's crop, or approaching that. Yeah, I think what we're also seeing is that depending on the state and the requirements for establishing a processing facility, that even though there are facilities and organizations that are building up their processing capacity, or starting in processing, it's taken some time to bring those online, and they're pretty expensive. I think a small setup starts at about $1 million investment. So Yeah, I think they will catch up from what I've heard. But again, seeing the newness of this industry, there's not a lot of data to sort of support some of this. And we're going to have to wait and see. Obviously, with less hemp being produced this year than the previous, that may help as well. One thing I think that also comes to mind here is that clearly producers in mitigating their risk really have been encouraged, or at least in more recently given price volatility, to try and find a processor before growing to lock in a price or a contract based on what the market price will be at harvest, so that they have somewhere. But as James alluded to, as well as Trey, there's been some issues with enforcement on these contracts even. And, you know, that's still, again, I think we need to kind of wait and see how this whole thing develops.
I would only add that it's not only the CBD processing and the extraction side of things, you've also got just the drying. Certainly in significant portions of the United States, product's got to be dried once it's out of the field before it can ever be extracted. And so, and you worry about product quality deterioration post-harvest. And so, yeah, I think there's clearly continued concerns about processing capacity, both to dry and to extract. And there's significant concerns about, is that an investment that's going to pay for itself? And you know, what's the return on that investment, given the volatility in the market and given the uncertainty of the market? And so I think that we're still going to see a lag in that capacity post-harvest that's not going to go away in the near future. And the only reason it's going to be less of an issue in 2020 is because there's just a lot less product going to be harvested.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly kind of my read, is that you have this geography question on top of it too. So, you know, does every single state need to have the same amount of processing capacity on hemp? You know, when I think about like the state of Michigan, for example, we've got this kind of historic tart cherry industry, but does every state need to have tart cherries so that we can all eat tart cherries? Well, absolutely not. So trying to understand where the best place for hemp to grow is I think an open-ended question still. And there is maybe a path dependence component to this, that obviously the southeastern United States has a little bit more history, you know, if you look at kind of Tennessee and Kentucky, et cetera. But I mean, all in all, I think we're still trying to understand exactly where the marketing avenues are. You know, one thing that really struck me when Brandon and I started working on the CBD demand stuff is there is like no research on this. like in terms of like consumer demand marketing stuff, you know, I can find a million papers on willingness to pay for local salmon, but I can't find like a single paper on willingness to pay for CBD. And part of it is we just haven't been able to do the work yet. So, you know, as this thing develops, it's all going to be, I think, a very localized market question, more so even than the national question itself.
Just to follow up on Trey's comment, part of that is also driven by regulation, state by state, the 50 different regulatory environments. So even if there's a state that might have, quote unquote, a comparative advantage in some kind of hemp production or processing, they may not even be able to transport it to where the market is. The arbitrage is prevented by the regulatory, where you're going across the state line from one state to another, where somewhere in between those two, the destination and the origin, there's a state that has a regulatory environment that can lead to seizure of product, and we've seen that already. And so that's going to continue to be a barrier in terms of sorting the market out.
We have another question from Boris Bravo Ureta. Are there agronomic advantages for hemp in crop protection? I know that we talked about, we were contacted by somebody from Ecuador that they have three harvests a year. So I guess going from marijuana to hemp is a cake. So, does anybody has knowledge on how to answer this question? There are advantages for hemp in crop rotations, which is a little bit related to that.
I see that we have Suresh who's Rigoberto and my co-author, he's an agronomist, so maybe he'd comment on what
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm Suresh Kimure, extension educator at UConn. I had a pleasure of working with Rigo and Jeremy on that paper. I work with hemp growers in the state. There is agronomic advantage of hemp as a rotational crop. It looks like most hemp growers are not much focused on that right now. And if they want to consider this as a rotational crop, it would be more advantageous to have hemp as a fiber crop as opposed to having CBD, because when you want to grow CBD, it's more of a horticultural type of crop production where you have more far spacing. You might need other additional cultural techniques such as plastic mulching, drip tape. So the cost of crop production would go up. So as a rotational crop, to be economically sound, the potential for hemp, especially as a fiber, I see that possibility. And also, this is a good candidate for bioremediations, clearing up contaminants in soil. So there has been some research ongoing on that topic as well. But as some of you already pointed out, we are early in this space, and we need to wait to get more and better information. But obviously, it's a potential crop per crop rotation and bioremediation.
Okay, so if you we don't have a huge number of people, so feel free also to thank you, Suresh. That was an interesting answer. If you have a question, you can ask it directly. Also, unmute your phone, your microphone. But we have another question here from Chris Lawton from Farm Credit East, and in regards to what might happen with international competition of hemp when you have legal permits to import CBD oil, for example, and products from other countries. What will happen to the domestic market? So anybody wants to take that question? We're always talking about the U.S., but there can be importation of products, which is going to compete with the what I call CBD producers.
I think we are a ways from having international competition for hemp products. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, we don't even know if like how easily it is for us to ship from Michigan to Ohio. So the idea of being able to transport borders internationally, particularly given the international trade turmoil that's ongoing right now, I mean, I think it's a crapshoot to imagine how this all is going to shake out, not only for hemp, but soybeans. I mean, we're all in this new place right now. I on the CBD side, I don't know. The localized market thing, I think, has a lot to do with, again, what James was talking about with regulatory constraints on intrastate trade. I would anticipate that that's going to work itself out. And, I think immediately I think about hops. So, on hop markets, most of the hops in the United States have been grown in the Pacific Northwest for a very long time because there is some type of comparative advantage in that area. In my mind, would imagine that looking like what hemp is in the long term for the United States. That's my guess.
In terms of international, the one part of the market, the hemp seed, hemp hearts, for food consumption, Canada has been exporting and had been working on developing that side of the hemp industry, the food crop. And so there has been quite a bit of international trade north-south between U.S. Canada of that product over the last 20 years. Like Trey says, we can't even trade with Canada right now for some things. So, you know, we're headed in a brave new world for international trade. So I think Trey's right. The big picture is that is a longer term issue to be resolved relative to what's happening in the short term. I mean, I think we're still trying to just sort things out here in the U.S.
Okay, anybody has any question? We have about 10 more minutes to go. I know that Trey mentioned Crop Scout, Christy. So, so I invite, extend an invitation to join, you know, with some perspective on the hemp industry.
So Christy, are you there? I don't know if she's there.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm here, Trey.
Okay. So Christy is an agronomist here, based out of Michigan, but oh my, I mean, you've been all over the Midwest and the Northeast, right, on hemp?
Yeah, I've traveled all over the Midwest and through the Hudson Valley. There's little pockets of concentrated hemp producers in different regions. So I've been able to see a lot of hemp over the last 2 seasons and work with a lot of different systems altogether, not just CBD, but grain and fiber as well.
So what are you seeing on the ground?
There's a lot of lamenting about the industry challenges that you guys have done a fantastic job of addressing or discussing today. I think that's probably our biggest challenge that we're facing right now is how do we open up these supply chains and make this happen? Because we have American producers that are really great at producing commodities. And so, you know, we've already proven that in the oversupply that we're currently in. So I think, you know, to me, in my opinion, I think it's most important to sort out who's going to own the regulatory components of this, because I feel like that is, you know, all of the production challenges aside, none of this is going to make sense if we can't get the USDA, the FDA, and the DEA to all get on the same page. That's really a double underscore for me, especially working with my farmers who have outlaid a ridiculous amount of cash to play in this game right now.
So what do you mean by that? Like get everybody on the same page? Is there conflicting regulations that people are hitting, and how are they hitting them?
As far as the regulations themselves conflicting, not necessarily, but the DEA making opinions about certain things and creating their own interim rules for something that was created in Congress, and, you know, who's enforcing what, and do we need enforcement from the DEA on a fiber crop that's not being consumed? You know, unfortunately, we're calling hemp hemp, and I really like the concept of calling this the hemp industries, plural, because it really is, and each of these sub-industries have their own cultures associated with them. And, you know, the CBD production, which is much more of a horticultural crop, I think has, you know, really interesting implications to be, you know, kind of go back indoors, in my opinion, so that we can produce hemp and or grain on a more field scale. Those crops are better geared for production systems that are broad acre farmers instead of these ultra small, ultra boutique style craft producers. I think there'll always be a small hunger for that, but right now there's so little hunger for all of it that we can't get the train to leave the station yet.
So, okay, you said something about cultures in there. I'm curious to hear you a little bit elucidate on what cultures you mean by, like, there are different cultures in the industry. Do you mean there are like the stoners and then there are the guys that are like classic farmers, or what do you mean by that?
So within, I'll call the 3 main chunks of hemp production, you have your cannabinoid production. And I think that that's more associated with a horticultural cropping system. So the cultural practices that would be associated with horticulture, you know, as it was mentioned earlier, the raised beds, the irrigation, the more handwork, more hand cultivation, that type of thing, being very, very different than something that would be a suitable cultural practice for, say, a broad acre farmer. And of course, there are, socioculture things, as, Trey mentioned. But I think that there is an appeal to, an American culture of conservation. There's implications of soil remediation potential and soil building, using the hemp for industrial hemp purposes, such as construction materials, and all of the cultural things that kind of are associated with that. So that's what I was referring to, not necessarily who's consuming or whatever of various things. But, there's these three subcultures. And in the grain and fiber realm, I think that there's a bit of crossover there in finding purposes for that plant to be utilized in livestock feed sources and human consumption in different ways. So I think there's three very different trunks that maybe have these overlaps in certain spots, but they all have their cultural practices fit, which is a term we use in agriculture of, what are your cultural practices for your cultivation? So does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I that was a great answer. Thanks.
Thank you. And we have another question. So Chris, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question? We don't have about your.
I was just commenting and sort of, I guess, agreeing with what Christy said, that I kind of envision hemp cultivation sort of falling into different market segments based on the end use of the product. With some becoming very commodity oriented and mechanized and larger scale for like fiber or grain production or whatever else, and a more horticultural type production system with higher inputs for the high CBD oil crops. That I was just kind of agreeing with her, I guess.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that too, exactly where Chris was going, and sort of my last slide at the top, I talked about China and Canada and Europe to an extent, and the established industries there. I think hearing some folks speak on this, there is concern over industrial fiber hemp and whether or not the textile manufacture in the US is really a viable enterprise, considering the infrastructure that would need to be built in order to process that. Furthermore, to James and Trey's points about sort of microclimate, the process of growing fiber hemp in the retting and having the right climate to lay it down and dry it and let it sort of decompose on the ground a little bit is pretty agroecologically specific. And so, in a place like New England, or even in certain parts of the Pacific Northwest, that are great environments for growing hemp to get the plants established and to flourish, when it comes to sort of the next step of drying, whether it's for CBD and mold considerations in the flower, or retting this fiber hemp, those are real issues that need to be resolved. But what I have heard is that actually companies like BMW, the car maker, have been working with fiber hemp to generate niche sort of materials and products that they're now using as sustainable alternatives to plastics and so forth on the interior of vehicles. And so there is the possibility with hemp fiber to look beyond sort of what we see coming out of China and their textile industry, and question whether or not that's a realistic future in the US at any scale, to more, well, what about industrial? What about building products for housing? We use a lot of wood products. Can we make particulate board for subflooring or for walls or for roofs out of hemp fiber? So again, I mean, this is all interesting, but it really, like was just pointed out by Christy, to grow at the scale to produce, this level is a tremendous investment. And when we don't necessarily have the clearest regulations, and we see that the top yielding fiber crops that we're bringing in from China and other places are very hot, by our 0.3% THC standards, you have molecular geneticists who are working to tamper those down by crossbreeding with low THC varieties. But B, I think it does get back to the point of how is this regulated and what are these regulations designed for? Clearly, if you're making fiber products and putting them in the wall of your home, if there's some THC in that, it shouldn't necessarily be of the greatest concern, but that's, you know, not for us to decide.
Okay, so we are over the limit. So we have one more question. Where can I find the recording of this webinar? So please contact me. I assume that the USDA promised that they will make this recording, the recording of this session available. So
you mean AAEA?
The AAEA. So
yeah.
So please contact me if you're unable to access the recording, and I'll be happy to share it. I mean, at least they promised to do that. Just to close in, so we are on top of the deadline now of the hour. So just to the three panelists, what do you think will be just a elevator type answer? 10 seconds. What do you think we will be 5 years from now with respect to the hemp industries? That's something I learned today. So James, we can start with you. We do it in reverse order.
Oh, okay. Well, I think it's slow and steady. You look at the Canadian example, 20 years, a lot of volatility, but if you do the growth trend, it's a steady up. I do think the one elephant in the room that could really undermine things is we've alluded to the phytoremediator techniques of hemp really sucks out heavy metals and dangerous chemical compounds out of the soil. I don't use CBD products, and I'm real hesitant to consume food seeds because I'm really worried there might be some mercury or arsenic in it. And so, I mean, that's what the plant does really well. And that could be that kind of event where there's that kind of contamination could really undermine the market. But otherwise, I think that it's slow and steady and successful long-term growth.
Trey?
Well, I'll double down on that. It doesn't even matter if it's the actual event. That perception of the event could be pretty catastrophic to the CBD market. So like you talk about mercury contamination, I'm doing a bunch of work with the aquaculture folks right now. There's a story right there, right? But I do think that we're going to see maybe a trajectory that's similar to what we've seen in like hops here, where you had a massive explosion of interest, and just like markets do, they kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. So we'll see the people who are really committed to this market stick around, and then we'll see the people who were never very serious lose their shirt on it. I think that there's a lot of potential, but not like this is the next corn potential, but more like this is a possible rotation or a possible way for growers to diversify their revenue streams.
Okay, Jeremy, finally, what does your crystal ball says for the next 5 years?
Well, I clearly, thanks a lot, everyone, for commenting on your questions. I think a lot's been brought up here. I totally agree with what James and Trey said. And I think to build on Trey's point about the prohibition on cannabis in general and legalization by state, I think the regulatory landscape is going to start to shift over the next 5 years. Not start, I think it's going to continue. And I don't know what will happen, but I think this notion of 0.3% THC as being sort of arbitrary, if we look at the history of it, might come under further consideration, as well as decriminalizing cannabis in general. So I would think that that would open the door. And to complement that, I do believe that given the amount of investment in genetics and in seeds and varieties and so forth, that in 5 years, we're going to have the sorts of new diversified varieties for different climates in the US, as well as the different uses. And I think that that will be a tremendous boon to sort of the technical efficiency of our farmers and their ability to grow this industry.
Okay, well, with that, we close in. Thank you, everybody. This was a very interesting session. And with this, we will see you sometime in person, I hope. Okay,
Thunder.
Goodbye, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.